Okay, well, Gene M. Frice, that's F-R-I-C-E, member of the 517th, and I was a long-time private, like most of the personnel in the 517th who were enlisted, stayed as a private, stayed as a PFC, and F Company, 2nd Battalion. I was the first scout in one of the platoons.
All right, let's start sort of in Italy then. Do you remember your first engagement, your first contact in Italy with the enemy?
Oh yes, we can all remember these places, but sort of hazy sometimes.
Don't worry about the name.
But I remember getting off the LCIs, and of course, you know that we went in above Anzio, and Anzio had pretty well wound down. But there was a sizable amount of German forces in that part of the country. And I remember getting off the LCI, and we hadn't got a couple of 100 yards when a massive explosion occurred partway up, and I think the Germans was something like a 155 millimeter howitzer. Probably only had one round to go, and they launched it. Didn't hit anybody, landed in an open field, but that was our, I guess you could call it our opening crescendo of wow. And then into the hills, and the 517 spent most of its career in every country we were in the hills or in the mountains. And we started up into the mountains above Civitavecchia, if I'm anywhere near pronouncing it correctly, above Anzio. And miserable, just like the Tennessee maneuvers, miserable, good training. And the first night we ran into a block of Germans on the mountain trails, and an exchange of probably one German with one machine gun, and I think he held up the whole battalion most of the night. But then there was rocket fire, and I have no idea whether it was ours or theirs, but none of it hit us. So we spent a lovely night in the rain, sleeping on the side of about a 40-degree mountain, and on the rocks, in the rain, a miserable night, but no more Germans that night. And the other remaining, probably that 1 week before we got initially pulled out, had one interesting experience. We'd gone into a village. Well, first of all, they sent us out on a pretty strong combat patrol, and allegedly the mission was to go around the German lines off of Highway 1, the Alban Highway, I think it was. And it was a combat patrol, go up there and fight Germans. And as we came into, didn't see any Germans, came into a village that had just been cleared of Germans, and we were met by the resistance forces who flocked around us with machine guns and everything else. And one gentleman produced a bottle of Calvados, I believe it was, and what appeared to be eggs, and they were eggs. And he would punch a hole in each end of the egg and suck it out with a gulp of Calvados. And he's presenting them to me and Lieutenant Harry Riddle, my platoon leader, and he looks at this, and these are eggs that are petrified. They're dead eggs. And Lieutenant says, I'm not drinking any of that rot gut, and I'm sure as hell not drinking or eating one of those eggs. And I said, well, Lieutenant, I tried it. I didn't like it, but they've got machine guns. So that was our first introduction to rotten eggs in a village. But we wandered around in the mountains on that patrol. Took us a day and a half, I believe it was. And my job the entire time I was in the military, I was a scout. And the only thing I can describe as the job of scout, let me change track here slightly, was I was at a cocktail party with Colonel Seitz, and a lady in her gown came up and said, "Well, Gene, you were, I understand, a scout. What's a scout do?" And Seitz described it. He says, "Well, I can tell you what we did was I would say, Frice, go up on that hill and see if there's any Germans up there." And it always worked very well. But anyway, on that patrol, we wandered around in these, Italy, as everybody knows, has got rough mountains. And we wandered around those that day and a half, and that last day, as a scout, I'm approaching a ridge. And as I get close to that ridge, I hear what sounds like vehicles. And I could hear that squeak of tanks that you can ever hear it once, you'll never forget it. I hear tanks, and I hear all kinds of vehicles, and I look over the top of the hill, and I see vehicles as far as the eye can see. And I thought, oh my God. So I told everybody, hey, hey, back, back, back. And then I look, and they're American vehicles. We're supposed to be 5 or 10 miles behind the enemy lines. And the Army has passed us and gone on. We hadn't eaten for a day or so, and we went to a mess hall, and I remember the mess sergeant was a very kind gentleman. He gave us pieces of white bread, wasn't bad bread, with a piece of Spam that was about 3 inches thick. And I mean, that was his saving our life from starvation, and I couldn't eat it. I cannot stand Spam. I can't stand it today. I almost get sick when I see it on TV. But anyway, no water, no food, and an interesting occasion. And that's about all I remember of any battle in Italy. And we didn't. Oh, one more I could add. Went out on a patrol one night, and went out with my squad, and we wandered around in a driving rain, couldn't see a thing, falling over rocks and bushes and tumbling down the hill, losing equipment, dropping weapons. And we did that for probably a couple hours, and then we're coming back into our lines, and we're yelling passwords back and forth, at which time I could hear an M60 machine gun that has a very distinct, very slow rate of fire. And we're yelling passwords, and it didn't seem to help much. So I was thinking of the most profane, disgusting things I could think of in vocabulary in the English language. And I finally got that across to them and got back through our own lines, almost having been killed. Dangerous, you know, your own people and weapons are very dangerous. So, but I think that's most of Italy. And of course, then we went up the coast for quite a ways into Grosseto, where we were part of that Grosseto group that was launched from there into southern France. So.
Let's talk about southern France. What's your most vivid memory of that?
Well, how many people have told you that after they exited, we were never fired at. We didn't receive any ACAC or anything. We jumped at a low altitude. I had no idea where we were, and I found out that the aircraft didn't know where we were either, which is not a good situation. But exited the aircraft, and the normal things that go, you lose half the equipment that's hanging around your body somewhere. And as I looked around and looked down, everything suddenly very quiet, a full moon. It was just beautiful, beautiful morning, 4:30 a.m. But I looked down, and then I'm listening. It's very quiet, and I can hear waves crashing over the rocks. And I thought, oh my. And I looked down, and I could even see the moon reflected in the water. And so I'm taking off my equipment as much as I could, prepared to do one of these things where we do a water landing and try to get away from the chute. And as we get closer, and I don't know what elevation we were, but it was probably 1,000 feet or under. So it was just a matter of seconds, really, before you hit the ground. And suddenly I hit the ground, or I hit a tree is what it was, and then went through the tree and hit the ground. And so and I could hear gunfire off in the distance, and I thought, well, we're here. And I'm getting out of my equipment, and first of all, when I first realized I was landing in water, I get my knife out, and I'm sawing on my equipment to get out of the chute completely. And I did cut some of it away, which I lost. And but then to get back on the ground again. So I'm getting out of my equipment, and we could hear the gunshots. And
so just to clarify here, you didn't actually land in the water.
No, we were in the mountains.
You were close.
We were in the mountains. No, we were 15, 20 miles, 30 miles away from the ocean.
So it was just a matter of the plane just had to go in a little bit further, and you were fine. You never were. There was never a danger.
No, we just saw it. I've talked to most of the guys, and they thought we were over water because all we could see was this layer of gray below us.
Which was a fog.
Which was fog, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. But you could see the reflection. It looked like a reflection of the moon on the water. Gotcha. And it was a reflection of the moon on the fog. Yeah. So once I hit the ground, I realized I'm on the ground. And we're in pretty heavily forested mountains, and I hear voices very close to me, so I'm looking for my companions, for my squad or my platoon or my company. And in what light we had coming through the fog, I could see people fairly close to me, and they're speaking in a guttural language, and I thought, oh my, I've landed a bunch of Germans. So I get my weapon, and I'm about to unlimber, and I'm looking at some of the figures out there. I didn't yell at any of them. I'm just listening behind a tree or something like that. Then I realized they're speaking English. And I was just about to nail one of them that was just 15 feet from me. And I realized they're speaking English, and I thought, oh, well. And then I look, but they're wearing, the other thing was they're wearing a helmet. I saw that helmet, and it's a German parachutist helmet. So that convinced me I'm amongst the Germans. But then he's speaking English. So then I realized that he's an Englishman, for gosh sakes. And I could not find any of my companions. And so finally I said something to the gentleman, and I suppose he said something like, oh, I say, old chop, or something like that. So I joined up with them, and it was, I would say, about a platoon of Brits, not a single American amongst them. And I have no idea how that happened. So they knew where they were going, basically the same Lemuy area. So I joined up with them. We started down the hill, and finally we started gathering a few Americans. As I say, I don't know how I ended up with them. Started down the hill. We ran into a few encounters with the Germans, but it didn't last long because they got out of there as quick as they could. It got a little worse as we got closer down towards the valley, but it took me probably that day, maybe into the next day, before we joined up with the rest of the troops in Lemuy. Yeah. So.
What about was there anything else that happened before you got to the Maritime Alps that is memorable?
Well, I can think of one pretty good one. I tell a lot of stories, and the painless ones, and generally the funny ones. So we're heading from Lemuy, headed towards Dragonal, which would have been to the west. And the first thing we encountered was grapevines. And grapevines are invariably planted in the opposite direction that you want to go, meaning about every 4 feet you got to climb through one of the lines of grapes. And usually they're reinforced by wires. So we were climbing through them, and very shortly we came under fire from MG-42, the German machine gun, and sniper fire. Okay, well, we were discussing getting across a valley filled with grapevines, and then we encountered some machine gun and sniper fire. So, but we didn't lose anybody in this little hike. The temperature was probably, I'd say, 90 or 100 degrees, and we had no water. One of the comforts of being in combat. So it was coming from a slight hill in front of us, and it appeared to be an outhouse, so not an outhouse in that sense, but an outbuilding. And as we got closer, why, the fire started falling off, and by the time we got up to the building, there was no fire. And a fellow by the name of Harold Bolt, who was in my squad, B-O-L-T, big lanky guy from Carolina. So he and I got on each side of the door, and we could hear movement inside the building. So I held up a grenade, and he shook his head, so I popped a grenade and threw it in the building, and it went off. So we sat there and listened for a few minutes. We're hearing more noise, and he's about to throw another grenade in, and all of a sudden a chicken walked out with about 5 or 6 little chickens, and their feathers were all ruffled up and backwards, and I don't think we killed a chicken. And so we jumped in the building, and we didn't kill any Germans because they were all gone, and it was a wine cellar. And the building was full of wine bottles, and we didn't kill any chickens, we didn't kill any Germans, and we didn't break a bottle of wine in there. So we...
So did you kill a few bottles of wine?
Well, no, that was next. And so as we got up over this little ridge and into the village, the villagers are coming out, and then, of course, it's Liberation. And so they're giving us... I didn't drink any wine at that point, but as we got into the village, why... The villagers are coming out with wine and some clear liquid which looked like and tasted like 7-Up. And so as I say, it's 100 degrees, and we're still getting fire from the other end of the village, and I'm sitting here drinking the 7-Up. And after the first bottle, I'm having trouble focusing my eyes on the Germans. And that continued for a while. Most of us were in pretty fair shape by the time the Germans left the village, but we didn't have a single casualty there of the troop that I was with. But one of my companions, Joe O'Brien, who was in my squad, I think he was one of the first of our troops to get killed, but he was located somewhere else at a crossroad, where he and I think one of the gentlemen that's here, Dahlberg, and Stephen Erickson, all of them in our squad, hid in a cellar for like a full day or something. But
the Germans were around them?
Oh yeah. It was. I don't know how we get so separated in this kind of a thing. When we're all in the same organization. But Joe O'Brien is a good friend of mine from California.
Our guy that we interviewed earlier today, what was his name?
I think that you interviewed Dahlberg earlier.
Not yet. We're talking. It's the guy who was captured. F Company.
Travis.
Yeah.
Merrill Travis, but he was captured up in Belgium.
Did you know him though?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was in your platoon though.
In the platoon, but not in the squad. Yeah.
What about the captain that you guys had? What was he like, Captain
Riddle?
Jenke?
Harry Riddle?
Juki.
Oh,
Yeah.
Juki.
What was he like?
He was a ridge runner from somewhere, I think Montana or Wyoming or something. He probably was one of the meanest guys that you can conceive getting as one of your leaders. He wasn't our platoon leader. He had another platoon.
Okay.
I think the 1st or 3rd platoon. I was in the 2nd platoon. I said he was one of the meanest because he was a 6'3", 6'5" guys, and most of our guys are little people because they don't make big parachutes.
Right.
Yeah. But what I find was he was big, he was loud, he acted terrible, he looked terrible, and but he had a heart of gold. He was a great leader, and of course there's a story about his capture.
They almost killed him
3 times.
You will tell us what you know.
Well, I don't. It's tales. I wasn't there secondhand, but I know the circumstances involved. He was in a foxhole with several other fellows. This is up in Bergstein.
We interviewed Merrill about the foxhole.
Yeah, okay. So Juki, I don't recall, I have never been able to spell his name, but pronunciation is Juki, stayed in that hole for a while, and the German, you know the story, the German came up and stood.
The foot.
Reached up and touched the foot of this guy. But somehow they captured him later, and it took probably a squad of German soldiers to be assigned to him because he scared them to death. They said, I don't know why they didn't kill him, but they signed these troops to guard him, but they had captured a German soldier. You heard that portion of the story?
Yeah, and he basically convinced them that, look, we captured this German soldier, we didn't kill him.
Yeah.
So you don't kill our guy.
Yeah.
And they
that
talked
was
him out of it.
Yeah, that was it. That was it.
I thought that's why I asked you about him, because I was interested in him. They said that he was so mean looking.
Oh,
they just wanted to kill him.
Ferocious, and he was tough.
Yeah.
And one of the toughest men. I think Bill Boyle was probably the toughest man I've ever seen in my life, Colonel Boyle, and then Lieutenant Juki. And I heard a sad tale about Juki that he was killed later in a knife fight, of all things. But he was a drinker. Right. I mean, he was everything about him was tough. Yeah, that's the story of Juki.
So, I guess moving along, in the Maritime Alps, did you have anything memorable there?
Well, it's probably one of the most memorable things and places in my life because I'm sort of a mountain goat. I've been in the mountains. I'm a California boy, but
you're still climbing, right?
Well, I don't know. I'm not climbing today. Yeah, but I've been in the mountains most of my life as a ski patrolman and served in the sheriff's rescue thing for years in Southern California. But it's country that's very familiar to me, and I'm very comfortable in that country because it reminds me of Santa Barbara, California, or San Luis Obispo, California. And I know going across, coming out of the valleys of southern France, it was a tough hike. I don't know the exact distance from Lemuy to Sospel, but that's a long ways. And under some of the worst terrain that you could ever travel across. And I found that I had very little respect for the American military equipment. I think the only friends that we had, and I can't say that, but the best friends we had was an M1 rifle, the .45 caliber pistol, and the Jeep. And we didn't have any Jeeps, so I don't know why I mentioned them. But our clothing was not useless, but all it was clothing. And by the time we'd been in those mountains, and we were there 93 days, I think it is, by the time the first 30 days were over, we'd worn our clothing out. We'd worn our boots out. We were constantly in need of water. The weather turned cold, it snowed on us, and we had gloves that were, I wouldn't wear gloves like what we were issued driving a car in cold weather. We had no parkas. We had the jumpsuit, which is a beautiful good-looking jumpsuit, but totally inadequate for being in combat. The jungle fatigues that came about later, both invented by the same guy, General Yarborough. The jungle fatigues of Vietnam were a first-class uniform, but not the jumpsuit. But anyway, going up into those mountains, and many patrols, a lot of combat, a lot of contact with the enemy. Not like Normandy. This was mountain warfare. And generally they were on the other side of the mountain dropping mortars all around us, and those, you've no doubt heard a lot about the forts.
Yeah, indeed. Is there a specific fort engagement, or where you guys tried to take one out, or?
Well, we never tried to take one out, but our patrols, almost from the time we left the Nice area and the Lemuy Valley, Dragonau Valley, you couldn't move on any of those trails. Anytime you'd reach a ridge or a trail or come down a road, those forts had they'd zeroed the weapons in on every crossroad, every culvert, everything that was there, and they'd done that probably in World War I. They were
Maginot Line. I've been up there.
Yeah.
It's very everything's interlocked.
Yeah, and that was, I think the Maginot Line was probably built World War II era, but these things were put in there in World War I by the French to keep the Italians out of France. But as we would run into those, I had one incident I was thinking of. Well, I know the Col de Bras area, which was probably when you first got into the real Maritimes. And each of the companies had their own sort of mission. And we had companies on our right and left that had their own mission, some mountaintop. Ours of F Company was described a very colorful description, was Hill 1098.
Yes.
Had nothing to say, but that's its altitude, 1,098 meters. But the first time we tried to take that, why, we just got blown right off the hill, had a number of casualties. And the second time and the third time, I think we probably went up there at least a dozen times over a period of probably a couple of weeks. And the game was, the protocol was that they would occupy it in the daytime, at the nighttime, and we would go up there first thing in the morning, and they would have a very good firefight every single time, and they would back off, and then during the, wait a minute, I got it backwards. We would be up there in the daytime, and they'd be at nighttime, and those forts would open up on us almost with a time sequence. If it was 7:27, you had better had your breakfast, your rations, and eaten them, because that's when they're going to open up. And I guess they had nothing to do in those forts other than read books and whatever, but typical German, what they call it, a term for that. Anyway, very scheduled. So we knew generally when they were going to open up, and they had tremendous weapons. I don't know what the caliber of those things must have been, and plus a lot of mortars. So everywhere we went, they'd blow us off of that spot. And I heard one of our staff officers say that we were there for a week or two, but we didn't have any casualties. Well, I think we had about probably 5 or 6 killed, and almost everybody in the organization was a casualty of one form or another. Right. Yeah. And
give me a feel for how high, or I mean, was it a steep hill?
Pardon?
Was 1098 steep, or what was the grade like? I mean, how'd you describe it to somebody that's never been there?
Most of that area was not, it wasn't a ridge, it was individual mountains. Okay. And then Col de Bras, which was behind us, was a ridge. And once we had a hard time at Col de Bras, and they fought for Col de Bras for quite a while, and a couple of the other companies cut a lot of casualties there. But once we came across Col de Bras, we dropped into another small valley of sorts, depression, and then we would be coming up on 1098. But each day they would blow us off the top of the mountain and we would retreat back. And I thought about it frequently. I thought, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're fighting for that thing. We lose it every day, but the Germans had to hold it because once we occupied that mountaintop and the others all the way up to Paracava, which is quite a ways to the north, and the other forts, why we then held the high ground and the observation of those forts. So we made no attempt to get the fort. We didn't have the strength to do anything about it. So ultimately, I believe it was Juki that took a patrol because it was awfully quiet, strangely quiet. And Juki took a patrol down into Sospel and found that they had completely pulled out. And they had to pull out and pull back up into Italy because they were losing it there. And of course the mission was for us to stop them from reinforcing Italy, to stop them from reinforcing the beachhead. And that was our basic mission, and we accomplished it, but it took a long time. A long time.
Very good. Now, as far as the Bulge goes,
yeah,
what was if you could do sort of a similar thing?
That was nasty.
Yeah.
A nasty life. And again, to start off with, the equipment. We were out of our jumpsuits; they were gone, and now we're.
You turned your weapons in, right?
Pardon?
Turned in most of your weapons.
No.
No. Crew served weapons were all turned in, weren't they?
No.
No.
Okay. No, we had our M60 machine gun, and it stayed with us throughout the whole thing. I don't know that it was ever replaced, but the clothing was one of the worst thing from an environmental standpoint. And I'd say by the time we got into the Bulge and had been there for a while, why I would imagine about half of our casualties were environmental. Feet, hands, noses and ears and stuff like that, and the clothing was totally inadequate. No gloves, no, we're still wearing jump boots. I think we finally got into what was called a tanker's boot, which is maybe a little better, not a very pretty boot like jump boots, but the tanker boot had buckles on it or something like that, and it was a little larger, but there was no drainage in those things. So you get them wet, the jump boot, the tanker boot, you get them wet, and your feet will freeze inside the boot. The jackets, the combat jacket is not an adequate piece of equipment for cold weather or hot weather as far as that goes. And being a skier, why I recognized that the civilian clothing was, and even in those days, was far superior to what we had. But we used to line Germans up against the wall, and they'd be yelling at us in German, "Nicht schießen, you know, don't shoot, don't shoot." And then no, we don't want to kill you. We want your boots, your gloves, and your poncho. And they had ponchos. You're familiar with the shelter half?
Yes.
It's a piece of sort of canvas kind of material
One that was like
of a half.
pattern.
And then, pardon?
It was like a splinter pattern that they had. It was a camouflage splinter pattern.
No, we didn't. We never got the camouflage ones. Ours was just sort of an OD color of a light canvas material that was at half, therefore the term shelter half, that you buttoned together so and it didn't even have a flap on the door on the first ones. And they had a very adequate poncho that could be buttoned together with others to form a shelter to wear as a poncho. And so we would say, hey, we don't want to kill you. We just want your boots, your poncho, and your gloves. So that helped. That helped. But the patrols, most of what we did in the Bulge was just platoon and company patrols. We were always attached to someone else. And I thought that maybe it's a good thing that we were not in Normandy, being an independent parachute organization, as it was a parachute regiment or combat team. I think if we had been in the Bulge, why, we would have suffered probably some of the worst casualties there. Reason being that we were not part of the 82nd, we were not part of the 101st, we didn't belong to any infantry division, so they would just plug us in wherever they needed an empty space to be filled.
Fire brigade, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And but we didn't have the cloak of a division to provide us with the support that we needed. And it's a wonder we weren't totally annihilated because of that. Because if the 504th needed support, you don't think division's not going to let them falter or die there. They're going to come in with the support. So everything was that tailored concept. If we needed artillery, why, somebody, I hope, is going to provide that support that you might not get. In communications, the same thing. If you're in a division, you've got a static kind of communications net, and we didn't fit into that net. And the command structure, those people of the 101st, 82nd, 26th Division or something, all had that command structure where all these officers knew each other. And ours are strangers to come onto the field. And so they split us up just constantly by battalions, by companies, to help a tank outfit out with infantry support. And that was an interesting, and as a PFC at the time, I didn't have either the maturity or the experience to know what was happening to the 517th. And now, well, you know, 65 years later and 30-something years experience in the military, I can say that was a serious mistake for small organizations to be splintered. But that was our job.
Was the attack on Monte Fosse pretty memorable? That attack, that was on January 3rd or 4th?
Yeah. Well, everything that was happening at that time, the earlier part of our arrival, which was late in December, I don't even know what date we went in there, probably about the 20th or something. But every day was just sheer misery, either from the weather and then what was happening, as we're constantly under fire, artillery and mortars. But the major events that we got involved, again, with a low rank enlisted perspective of the firefight, our vision and our knowledge of what's happening is sort of related to forest for the trees or something. We very seldom ever knew where we were going. I think that probably we were, I'm not saying that this as far as good leadership, but I think we were constantly suffering a lack of information of what the mission was and where we were going. We had excellent officers. I can't say the same for, I don't know that if anybody has mentioned this, but some of the non-coms that we got as cadre were not adequate for enlisted command, and we lost most of them. I don't know that very few of them. Our first sergeant was an excellent man. He was regular Army, and we had 2 or 3 others that were excellent, but a lot of them were not. And that's part of the chain of command, that take care of your troops, keep them informed of the mission, and I think that's one of the, and then lead them adequately. And that was not done as well as it could have been. Yeah.
Can you provide a similar memory or incident like you did with southern France or the mountains in the Bulge?
Well, can I give you a humorous one?
How about one that's a little hard? You've given us some pretty good humorous ones, but...
Well, this was part, it ended up being humorous, but there was nothing funny about it. As first scout again, And Gareth Davis was my partner scout. And he made it from beginning to end, but after having been wounded 3 times, I think. Got up early one morning, and I think that this was probably before Sunbith and that area there. And we're going down a mountain trail. The snow is maybe a foot deep or something like that. And I'm in front, and I think I must have been assigned to another platoon or another company, because I don't know who was behind me. One lieutenant, I remember, was there. And we came around a curve in the trail. I hadn't heard anything, but as soon as I came around the curve in the trail, I looked down in this meadow below me, and I see about 40 or 50 Germans down there. And they saw me. And I know now that it was a mortar platoon. And so as is necessary in a military engagement, why everybody starts shooting at everybody else. So I took cover. They had no cover. So it was easy to fire down on them. And then as everybody's coming up behind me, why they're adding their firepower to what's going on, and nobody of our people had been hit. So they start running across, they grab their weapons and ran across the trail in front of me into the woods, right in front of me and above me. And all this firing still going on. So now we're lined up in 2 flanks, our flank on the trail and them above us in the brush, in the woods. And everybody shooting at everybody else. And I looked up at this one tree above me, and I see a German there, and we actually made eye-to-eye contact. So he shot at me and missed, and I shot at him and missed or something, and he stepped out a couple of times like that. And I thought, what the hell's he doing? I'm going to kill him. But it was really odd, and there was almost a pause in the battle between he and I. And then I thought, I think he's trying to surrender. So I had a little bit of German knowledge, and so I yelled, ceasefire. So here's a PFC up at the front yelling ceasefire, and somebody back there thought, well, that must have been the captain or the lieutenant or something. And I had to yell it a couple times, and we did, and they did. So now we're all looking at each other.
The Germans and you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, most of them are still under cover, but I could see the guy. He came out from behind the tree. And I said, Kamerad, kommen Sie hier, an die Ho, nicht schießen. And that didn't work for a few minutes. So I yelled it 2 or 3 times, and finally they came out. And we'd killed, I don't know, 2 or 3 that I know of, and a couple down in the meadow. None of us got hit. So they came down. And we lined them up, searched them, and there's sergeant or sergeant major, a guy with a whole bunch of stuff all over him, you know, and a real Nazi. He was very unhappy about this, but we had hit him in the back, and it had gone completely across his back and opened him up, just something awful. But he was up and able to exercise command, and he got these guys lined up. So as before they left, that German came up and he says, I want to thank you. He said, this rotten war is over, and the rotten Hitler is gone, or, you know.
He said
and
in German or English?
Perfect English.
Wow.
And he says, by the way, I was raised in the United States, and when I was 15 or 16, my parents took me back to Germany. But he says, thank you for stopping this war for us. But he said, do you know what you said? And I said, certainly. Comrade, kommen Sie hier, an die Ho, nicht schießen. You know, comrade, come here, hands up, don't shoot. And he says, well, almost. What you said was, comrade, come here, hands up, don't shit. Sorry about that.
No, this music behind us is just not working. But I'm loving the story.
This is great. We got to keep going.
Let's keep going.
And it's like Oh, by the way, this story, you want to use him for southern France and the mountains. That was an excellent description of
Okay.
the gear and the climate. And then your story here is excellent. And what time frame was this? Is it a counterattack?
This would have been, oh no, this is before Foss. And
Okay, so
it was fairly early in January.
well,
No,
okay.
oh, no. It would have been in December.
It would have been December, like 23rd.
In December before the weather cleared up, and
All right, so this would be December 23rd
probably
before the counterattack.
even before Christmas would have.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking, 22nd, 23rd.
yeah.
Great
But
story.
I'd have to think of when we were in Saint Vith.
Saint Vith
Saint
was
Vith.
not until January 16th or so.
Well, okay. I guess it didn't have any. Well, I'll tell you what.
It was after. Was it after? It was not after Foss, right? Or
No,
was
it would have been before Foss, and
Good.
probably early in December then, because we still had the overcast and we didn't have that air support. I can get the date for you because. Well,
It's not that important. We just
yeah.
wanted to know. As
Well,
long
here's another thing I'd like to mention.
Okay.
13th Airborne Division.
Right.
Okay,
Never jumped.
and you know the history of the unit. We were with the 17th, took the training with the 17th,
Right.
and they needed troops in Italy, and they also needed somebody to jump into southern France. So they pulled us out of the 17th, and we trained for a very short amount of time, I think the Tennessee maneuvers, and then went straight to Italy. And we never had any contact with the 17th Airborne again. And they didn't come over until 8 months or a year later. I don't know what happened to them, but
Yeah. that's
okay.
right.
And then we had, of course, had no direct contact with it. Well, we didn't have any command contract with any other airborne units, the 82nd, 101st, or anybody else, unless we were attached to them. So we never did have another division in charge of us until the war was over, or shortly before the war was over, in which the 13th Airborne arrived from the States. And they didn't get over there until the war was really winding down in the number of days. Okay, going back to this incident again. Lieutenant, well, forget his name now. We call him Preacher. He was a young, inexperienced, recent appointee. He was with us in southern France, and then went with us up into the Bulge. And he was there with me. He was 2 or 3 men behind me when we ended up with this firefight on the trail. So with what happened there, he put me in for a bluing medal, and he put me in for a DSC. And I never heard anything about it, and I think the war was over, and I get a letter from the 13th Airborne Division, and with a piece of parchment with it that said Certificate of Merit. And it did outline in detail what had happened. So I got this piece of paper, no medal, piece of paper. And 10 or 12 years later, from the Department of Army, I get a Bronze Star. Wow. But I've been put in for a DSC. But the 13th Airborne, and I know this to be a fact, 13th Airborne took over, and probably hundreds of decorations never went anywhere. They were trashed. They psychologically attacked our officers because for failure to maintain personnel records, combat records, casualty records, maintenance on weapons, lost weapons, and such as that. And we're talking about court-martialing our officers for this failure while in combat.
Wow.
That was the 13th Airborne, and they tried to do all kinds of dastardly things to us, but so we have had and have no use for the 13th Airborne Division.
Last couple questions. Do you have a similar story in like Bergstein up in the Hercules?
No, I got hit Somewhere about the 25th or
Around Hunnage or
Hunnage, probably.
okay.
And I got hit, and it was 3 weeks probably before I got back to the unit.
Battle. This is where this is the textbook battle, sort of. Where
Oh, yeah.
the Sites put 13 battalions on top of Hunnage.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you remember?
Of the artillery.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Our artillery was one of our greatest saviors, other than the few times
Right.
friendly fire. I mean, we actually had casualties from friendly fire, but I mean, we got a war going on. So, but the artillery did a tremendous job throughout the war. You know, and I almost got to the point sometimes that I felt sorry for the Germans. And then the air, you know.
Overwhelming firepower.
And then we even had friendly fire from P-51s, and I think on one occasion P-38s and some aerial bombs. But yeah, the Germans, they got blasted. And if it hadn't have been for them running out of fuel, they might have been successful in the Bulge. They just flat, as I saw tanks. I had a tank, one tank that I was talking to Irma, I think it was, the lady in Belgium, and she was telling me that I had a minor fracas with a 3.5 rocket launcher. It was a totally ineffective weapon. And I had fired at a tank, and somehow she heard something about this 20 years later, and in one of those cities, Davelat or something, said it's a tank. And it was in Foss, the village of Foss.
Used a rocket launcher against that, a bazooka?
Totally ineffective. Fired 3 rounds. 1 round ricocheted off as they had, it was the pointed version of the rocket.
Yeah, those are
just
bad.
boom, it went off. Fired another one, which I missed. Fired the third one, which hit the treads, which I was aiming for, and ineffective. And then we had to get out of there. But she heard something about that story, and she told me, she said, this is not your tank. And I said, what tank? And the tank you shoot at, that's not your tank. And I said, well, I don't know. But she says, you didn't kill it. I said, I know I didn't kill it. But she says it ran out of gas. Yeah.
That was good. It was excellent.
Yeah.
Very good.
Well, I went on from there. I went on to Berlin. I didn't have anything to come home to, so I went on to Berlin, and I spent about 8 months there. Had a good job. I was sergeant of the guard for the Anhalter Bahnhof, and enjoyed myself in Berlin. And
Any run-ins with the Russians?
Oh yeah, and you know, the war was over, and we're the occupational forces, and I'm in the Bahnhof, and then night falls, and we end up getting in firefights with the Russians.
Wow.
Yeah, and they had probably, our job was to secure the Bahnhof, but the reason was to try to keep it open for the German refugees that had been forced out of their homes by the Russians in eastern Germany. And here's these women and children, and they're starving. They're just infested with all kinds of diseases. I mean, it was terrible. And then here come the Russians feeding off of these poor people. You know, so we now have to defend the Germans. Yeah. No, that was the bad part of that one.
What do you mean by firefight? Or how did you defend them?
Gunfight.
Yeah.
Well, they
Was
would
it
be
at night or at day? Or?
well, always at night, yeah. And these would generally, the Russians had a real morale problem in Berlin. And these would be renegades, drunks, and coming in trying to rape and pillage and burn. And these Germans had nothing, absolutely nothing. And they'd try to grab a gal and pull her out, and we'd end up saying, that's not going to happen. So we did have firefights, and we killed a few of them. But we never got along with the Russians. Never did there. And it was a low grade of poor country, low grade of soldiers and poor country boys, farm boys, and they were just cannon fodder when they took Berlin. So anyway.
Excellent.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.